10 weeks ago, Elena Vasquez sold the only thing she had left that held any value in this world, the last remnant of her dignity that she had clung to through 28 years of struggle and sacrifice. And she told herself with a conviction that tasted like copper pennies in her mouth that it was merely one night, a simple transaction between two consenting adults that would vanish like smoke the moment the sun rose over the Manhattan skyline. But now, as she stood in her classroom at Jefferson Elementary, with her palms sweating against the chipped laminate of her desk, she watched through the rain-streaked windows as a sleek black sedan pulled into the faculty parking lot with the kind of precision that screamed old money and dangerous intentions. And she knew with a certainty that made her stomach clench that the man stepping out from the back seat beneath the black umbrella held by his silent assistant was the same man who had traced the curve of her spine in a penthouse suite 8 weeks prior, the same man who had left $50,000 in an envelope on a silk pillowcase, and he was looking at the school building with an expression that suggested he had not come to settle a debt, but to claim something he believed he already owned. Before I continue our story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Elena had grown accustomed to the particular rhythm of poverty, the way it manifested not in dramatic moments of destitution, but in the slow erosion of small dignities, in the empty coffee cups that accumulated on her desk because she could not afford the decent kind at home, in the worn-down heels of her sensible teaching shoes that clicked against the linoleum floors of Jefferson Elementary with a rhythm that announced her arrival to her second-grade students 5 seconds before she appeared in the doorway. She was 28 years old and carried the exhaustion of someone twice her age, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun that was already loosening by 7 in the morning, her fingers stained with red ink from grading papers under the flickering fluorescent lights of her classroom until 2 in the morning because she refused to let her students fail simply because the system had failed them first. The school district had cut funding again last semester, eliminating the arts program and reducing the nursing staff to 3 days a week, but Elena stayed. She always stayed, because somewhere between the free lunch forms and the mold growing in the ceiling tiles, she had found a purpose that felt like a lifeline thrown to her across the choppy waters of her own circumstances.
But the universe, it seemed, had decided that her burden was not yet heavy enough, that she had not yet been pressed to the ground with sufficient force to break her completely. And so it had delivered the diagnosis 3 months prior with the casual cruelty of a bureaucrat stamping a form. Sofia Vasquez, 65 years old, early onset Alzheimer's, rapid progression, requiring immediate experimental treatment not covered by insurance. And the number that the doctor had written on the back of his business card had made Elena's vision tunnel at the edges. $50,000, a figure so large that it might as well have been $1 million, a ransom demand for the only person who had ever loved Elena unconditionally. Sofia had been a seamstress in the garment district for 40 years, her hands gnarled now, but still reaching for Elena with the instinct of a mother recognizing her child even through the fog of neural decay. And Elena had sat in that hospital room watching her mother struggle to remember her own name while the machines beeped their steady countdown, and knew with a clarity that burned that she would do absolutely anything to buy more time. The apartment had been the first thing to go, or rather the illusion of the apartment as a sanctuary, because Elena came home one Tuesday evening in October to find the power cut off, the digital clock on the microwave dark and silent, the refrigerator humming its death rattle as the insulin for Sofia's diabetes began to warm and spoil on the top shelf, and taped to the door with industrial-strength adhesive that took her 20 minutes to scrape away was the eviction notice, 72 hours to vacate or the sheriff would arrive to remove them. Elena had stood in the darkening hallway with the paper trembling in her hands and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a cracking sound like ice breaking on a frozen river, and she had walked to the bathroom and stared at her reflection in the mirror with the kind of detachment that frightened her, wiping away the smudged eyeliner from her 12-hour shift at the school, removing the tinted lip balm, and then slowly, methodically applying the makeup again, but differently this time, as armor, as costume, as the mask she would need to survive what came next. Maria had been the one to plant the seed. Maria, who had been Elena's best friend since they were both girls in the foster system, sharing a room with 6 other children. Maria, who had climbed out of the same poverty through a different door, and now planned high-end events for men who had more money than conscience. And they had met for coffee that Elena could not afford at a cafe where the baristas looked at her thrift store coat with barely concealed pity. Maria had leaned across the table with her manicured hands wrapped around a porcelain cup and spoken in a voice barely above a whisper about arrangements, about men who paid for discretion, about how sometimes the transaction was just that, a business deal. And Alina had felt her coffee rise in her throat and had vomited in the cafe bathroom with the kind of violence that left her gasping, telling herself no, never, that she would find another way, that there was always another way for people who worked hard and followed the rules. But the rules, she was learning, were written by people who had never stared at a 72-hour eviction notice while their mother's medication spoiled in a dead refrigerator. And so 3 days later, with the sheriff's visit looming and Sophia's doctor appointment revealing that without the experimental treatment, her mother had perhaps 3 months of coherent existence remaining, Alina had called Maria and asked for the number, her voice steady as stone, though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone.
The hotel had been one of those glass and steel monuments to excess that Alina had only ever seen from the outside, the kind where the doorman wore white gloves and the elevator rose so fast her ears popped before she reached the penthouse suite. And she had stood in the marble foyer with her cheap coat, feeling like a fraud, like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes, certain that at any moment security would arrive to escort her out. But the man who opened the door was not what she had expected, not the greasy predator of her nightmares or the cruel aristocrat of her prejudices, but someone young, 35 perhaps, with dark hair threaded with premature silver at the temples, and eyes that looked like they had seen something terrible and had never quite recovered from the sight. He had been wearing a suit that probably cost more than Alina's annual salary, tailored to his broad shoulders with the kind of precision that suggested it had been made for him specifically. But his hands, when he gestured her inside, were gentle, almost hesitant, and he had asked her name with an intensity that made her lie. "Lily," she said. "My name is Lily." And he had smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes and said, "No, it isn't, but that's all right. We all need our masks tonight." The suite itself had been designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering sprawl of the city, furniture that looked like art and probably was, a bed the size of Alina's entire studio apartment with sheets that felt like liquid silk against her skin. And Alina had stood in the center of it all feeling small and transparent and terribly, irrevocably alone. Theo Blackwood, that was the name Maria had given her, though she suspected even that was a construction, a placeholder for a real identity that he shed like snakeskin each time he engaged in these transactions. But when he approached her, he did not touch her immediately, did not grab or demand or take with the entitlement she had steeled herself against. Instead, he had stood a foot away and asked about her day, about her supposed orphan status and her fabricated student loans. And she had spun lies that tasted like ash, because she could see in his expression that he knew, that he recognized the particular desperation of someone backed into a corner with no exits remaining. And when he finally did touch her, his fingers brushing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her want to weep, he had whispered in the dark with his breath warm against her ear, that she did not have to pretend with him, that for just this one night they could both stop performing. And she had almost broken, had almost confessed everything about Sophia and the eviction and the $50,000 that sat like a brand on her conscience. But she had bitten her tongue until she tasted blood, and let him lead her to the bed where the city lights painted patterns on their skin through the glass walls.
In the morning, she had awakened to an empty room and the gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains, and on the pillow beside her, where his head had rested only hours before, lay a check for $50,000 made out to cash, and a business card with nothing but a phone number handwritten in elegant script, and on the back, a note that read, "If you ever need anything." And she had stared at it for a long time with her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. And then she had torn it into 4 pieces and dropped them into the wastebasket. Or at least that is what she told herself she had done, what she intended to do. But her hands had moved of their own accord, folding the fragments small enough to fit into her wallet, pressed against the photograph of Sophia taken before the illness had stolen her radiance. She had dressed with mechanical precision, not looking at the bed, not looking at the mirror, and had taken a taxi directly to the hospital, where she had paid the first installment of her mother's treatment in cash, the bills so new they stuck together. And when Sophia had opened her eyes later that afternoon with a clarity that had been absent for weeks, recognizing her daughter with a smile that broke Alina's heart, saying, "You look tired, mi amor. What have you been doing?" Alina had taken her hand and lied with a smile that felt like it would crack her face, saying, "Nothing, Mama, just working extra shifts. Everything is going to be fine now. Everything is going to be all right." 8 weeks passed with the grinding slowness of geological time, each day a battle against the memory of that night and the knowledge of what she had become, and Elena threw herself into her teaching with a desperation that bordered on mania, arriving before sunrise and leaving long after the custodial staff had finished their rounds, her second graders responding to her frenetic energy with a mixture of concern and affection that only made her guilt dig deeper into her chest. She developed a ritual of panic, locking herself in the staff bathroom during lunch breaks with her forehead pressed against the cool metal of the stall door, counting her breaths, reminding herself that the transaction was complete, that Theo Blackwood was a ghost, a phantom that had been exorcised with the payment of the medical bills. But then she would catch sight of her reflection in the bathroom mirror and see the shadows under her eyes and the way her clothes hung looser on her frame, and she would remember his hands and the way he had looked at her like he was drowning and she was the shore. Marcus, the fourth grade teacher who brought her coffee she did not ask for and noticed the weight she was losing, had tried to draw her out, sitting on the edge of her desk with his kind eyes and his patient silence, representing everything normal and good and attainable that Elena had forfeited with a single night's decision. And she had pushed him away with excuses about stress and her mother's health, knowing that she could never explain the barrier that now existed between her and the world of ordinary dating, ordinary courtship, ordinary love.
The fainting spell had happened during the science lesson on photosynthesis. Elena standing at the whiteboard with a marker in her hand, explaining how plants convert light into energy, when the room had tilted sideways and the voices of her students had receded into a high-pitched whine, like a television tuned to a dead channel, and she had woken up on the floor, with little hands potting her face and someone screaming for the nurse. They had taken her to the hospital. Routine procedure, they said. Probably just dehydration or low blood sugar, but Elena had known even before the doctor confirmed it with the blood test, had known with the instinct of a body betraying its secrets, and when she had stared at the positive result on the pregnancy test in the hospital bathroom, her hands shaking so violently she had to sit on the floor to keep from falling, she had felt the floor drop out from beneath her world for the second time in 2 months. Sarah, the school counselor who had driven her to the hospital and who had found the test in Elena's bag while searching for her insurance card, had sworn to keep the secret, her eyes wide with the particular shock of someone realizing that the ground is less solid than they had believed. And Elena had driven home in silence with her hand pressed against her still flat stomach, thinking of Theo Blackwood and the business card she had kept, the number memorized now from running her fingers over the torn edges so many times. The letter arrived on a Saturday morning, no stamp, no return address, slipped under her apartment door while she was sleeping, a thick cream envelope that smelled like expensive cologne and old money, and inside, along with a newspaper clipping showing Theo Blackwood, Billionaire CEO, announcing the expansion of his educational philanthropy programs into underfunded districts, was a handwritten note on heavy cardstock that read, "I know your real name now, Elena Vasquez, and I know about your mother at St. Catherine's Hospital, and I know that you kept my card, and we need to talk." And the handwriting was the same elegant script from the hotel room, and Elena had sat on her kitchen floor with the letter in her lap and felt the walls of her carefully constructed compartmentalization come crashing down around her. She had not slept for 3 days after that, jumping at every sound, expecting him to appear at her classroom door or at her apartment or at the hospital where Sophia was showing remarkable improvement, the experimental treatment working better than the doctors had dared to hope. And Elena had watched her mother painting watercolors in the activity room with a steadiness of hand that had been absent for months, and she had thought, I cannot regret it. I cannot regret him, even though the knowledge of what she had done sat in her stomach alongside the new life growing there like a stone.
Parent-teacher night at Jefferson Elementary was usually a sparsely attended affair. A few concerned mothers and absentee fathers trickling through the gymnasium where the teachers sat at folding tables with their grade books and their tired smiles. But Elena had been expecting no one for Zoe Blackwood, a quiet second grader who sat in the back row and drew elaborate pictures of birds instead of doing her mouth worksheets, a child who wore expensive clothes but seemed to carry a sadness that was too heavy for her small frame. Elena had been exhausted, 7 weeks pregnant now and nauseous, her blazer straining slightly across her chest. And she was packing up her materials when she felt the temperature in the room drop, felt the shift in energy that made the other teachers look up. And there he was, Theo Blackwood, standing in the gymnasium doorway in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, not looking at the other parents, not looking at the principal who was scurrying over to greet the billionaire donor, but looking directly at Elena, with an expression that was not predatory, but something far more complicated, something that looked like recognition and regret and a hunger that had nothing to do with the physical. He waited until the room had emptied, until the custodian had begun sweeping the floors in the hallway outside. And then he had closed the classroom door behind him with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. And Elena had stood behind her desk with her hands flat on the surface to stop them from shaking, ready to scream or fight or flee. But he had simply stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at her with those haunted eyes, and said, "She is my daughter. Zoe is my daughter. Her mother died 2 years ago, and I have been absent. I have been trying to buy her way through the grief with toys and private tutors and anything to avoid being present in her pain." Elena had felt the world tilt again, the pieces clicking into place with terrible clarity, and she had whispered, "Why are you here? Why now?" And he had taken a step closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, and confess that he had not chosen her randomly that night, that he had seen her first in the hospital stairwell 3 days before their transaction, had watched her crying on the steps between the oncology ward and the parking garage, had followed her to the school and learned her name and her situation, had arranged the entire meeting through Maria without her knowledge.
The revelation had landed like a physical blow. Elena staggering back against the whiteboard with her hand over her mouth, and Theo had continued, his voice breaking, explaining that he had known about her mother, had known about the experimental treatment, had known about the eviction, and that the transaction had never been about possession or conquest for him, but about the only way he knew to help her without destroying her pride, without making her feel like a charity case, because he had been watching her for weeks and had seen her devotion to Sophia, had seen the way she sat by her mother's bedside, reading aloud from fashion magazines even when Sophia no longer recognized her own name, and he had wanted, desperately and shamefully, to be close to that kind of love, to purchase proximity to it if he could not generate it himself. The second confession had been worse, had been the one that made Elena's knees buckle, because Zoe was sick too, a genetic condition, terminal without experimental treatment, the same doctor at St. Catherine's Hospital, the same wing where Sophia was recovering, and Theo had been drowning in the knowledge of his daughter's mortality and had seen Elena in that stairway, had seen her fighting for her mother with a ferocity that made his own grief feel less solitary, and he had orchestrated the entire night, not to use her body, but to be in the presence of someone who understood the particular agony of watching a parent fade. Elena had struck him then, her palm connecting with his cheek with a crock that echoed in the empty classroom, and then she had grabbed his lapels and kissed him with a violence that tasted like tears, breaking down against his chest with sobs that shook her entire body, saying, "You made me a whore to save my mother. You made me compromise everything I believed about myself, and you did it because you are dying inside, and your daughter is dying, and you wanted to feel something real, anything real." And he had held her, had wrapped his arms around her with a desperation that matched her own. And in the struggle, her bag had fallen to the floor, spilling its contents across the linoleum, including the vintage music box that Sophia always carried, the one that played the lullaby Elena had been sung as a child. Theo had bent to retrieve it, his fingers tracing the worn wood, and he had wound the key with a familiarity that made Elena freeze, because when it opened and the melody filled the room, he had whispered, "My wife used to sing this to Zoe before the cancer took her." And Elena had understood then that their collision was not random, that the threads of their pain had been weaving together long before that night in the penthouse.
The school board had found out 3 weeks later, an anonymous tip delivered in a manila envelope containing photographs of Elena and Theo in the classroom, the kiss visible, the intimacy undeniable, and Elena had been called before the superintendent with the threat of termination hanging over her head. Inappropriate relationship with a parent, conduct unbecoming, the kind of administrative language that could destroy a career she had sacrificed everything to build. Theo had tried to fix it with money, of course, because that was the only tool he knew how to wield, offering to endow the school with a grant that would secure its budget for a decade if they would simply overlook the indiscretion. But Elena had refused, had stood in his office with her chin high and her hands resting protectively over the slight swell of her belly and said, "You cannot buy my dignity twice. You cannot purchase my forgiveness." And he had looked at her with an expression of such profound respect that it had almost been worse than his desire.
But the revelation that changed everything came not from Theo or from the school board, but from Zoe herself, the quiet girl with her bird drawings and her inherited sadness, who appeared at Elena's apartment door one evening with her backpack and her eyes red from crying, saying, "I saw you that night at the hotel. I followed my dad because I was angry at him for leaving me with the nanny again, and I saw you go into the elevator together, and I know what happened, but I am not here to hurt you." The child had stepped inside with a maturity that broke Elena's heart, had sat at the kitchen table with her small hands wrapped around a glass of milk, and it said, "You made him smile for the first time since my mom died. I heard him humming that song, the one from the music box, and he hasn't been drunk since that night, and he looks at your picture from the school website every evening. So please, don't leave. Don't make him go back to being a ghost." And Elena had held this broken little girl who was carrying the same stone of parental mortality that Elena had carried, and had cried with her until the streetlights came on outside.
The final twist came from Dr. Chen at St. Catherine's, calling Elena into his office with a confusion that was evident in his carefully neutral expression, explaining that Sophia's second round of treatment had been paid for by an anonymous donor, but that the hospital's records had finally traced the source, and it was not Theo Blackwood, as Elena had assumed, not the man who had bought her night and left his card and was trying to buy her forgiveness now, but rather a name she had not heard spoken aloud in 20 years. A man who had abandoned his family when Elena was 8 years old and never looked back. Her own father, resurfacing through the hospital's financial records like a ghost from a past she thought she had buried. The money Elena had been using, the safety net she had believed came from Theo's guilt and desire, had actually come from two men with secrets, two men who had watched her from the shadows and tried to purchase redemption through her salvation. And Elena had sat in Dr. Chen's office with the knowledge settling over her like a heavy fog, understanding that her entire existence had been financed by the remorse of absent men. Sophia had a lucid moment that evening, more clear than she had been in years, sitting in her wheelchair in the hospital garden with the music box in her lap, and she had taken Elena's hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong and said, "You sacrificed something for me, mija. I can see it in your eyes, the way you carry yourself now, the weight that wasn't there before. But listen to me carefully. Do not let it destroy you. Do not let the transaction define the treasure." And Elena had wept against her mother's shoulder while the music box played its melancholy tune, understanding that Sophia knew, had perhaps always known, and had loved her anyway. Theo had appeared at the garden gate then, not with flowers or grand gestures, but with Zoe's hand in his, and he had not tried to enter, had simply stood there with an expression of such raw vulnerability that Elena had felt the last of her anger dissolve, not into forgiveness, not yet, but into the possibility of something else, something that might be built rather than bought. In the end, there was no dramatic proposal, no cinematic declaration of love that solved everything, no redemption arc that wiped clean the moral ambiguity of their beginning, but rather a slow and tentative shifting of patterns, Elena returning to her classroom with her pregnancy visible now beneath her dresses, teaching her students with the same fierce dedication, but with a softness that had been absent before. And Theo appearing in the back of the room during the final period, not to possess or to claim, but simply to watch, to be present, to show up in a way that he had failed to do for his daughter and his wife. Zoe began raising her hand in class, engaging for the first time in months, her bird drawings evolving into portraits of her mother that she showed only to Elena, and Sophia would sit in her wheelchair in the hallway outside the classroom, the music box playing its endless loop, watching her daughter teach with an expression of pride that needed no words. Theo offered once, standing in the parking lot after school with the autumn leaves swirling around their ankles, "Let me take care of you, both of you," meaning the baby, meaning the life that was growing inside her that was half his and half the woman she had been that night. But Elena had not said yes, had not said no, had simply looked at him with the knowledge of all that had passed between them and said, "I don't need saving, Theo. I need partnership. I need consistency. I need you to earn the right to be present." And he had nodded with an understanding that seemed to cost him, agreeing to her terms, to her timeline, to her refusal to be purchased even now. The final image was not of a kiss or a wedding or a tidy resolution, but of Elena standing at the whiteboard with chalk dust on her fingers and her child kicking beneath her ribs.
Theo sitting in the small plastic chair in the back corner with his legs folded awkwardly and his attention fixed entirely on her, Zoe raising her hand to answer a question about migration patterns, and Sophia in the hallway with the music box playing the lullaby that connected them all, a web of debt and grace and damaged people trying to love each other without breaking. Some transactions can never be paid back. Some debts bind us forever. But as Elena looked from her students to the man who had bought her and then learned to simply stay, she thought that maybe, just maybe, that was not always a prison. Maybe sometimes, for people brave enough to try, it could become a family. And if you think Elena's story is complicated, wait until you hear what happened when Zoe's biological mother's sister showed up claiming Theo wasn't the father and demanding custody of the child who was carrying the genetic key to a medical trial that could save hundreds of lives. What would you have done in Elena's position? Would you sacrifice your morality to save your mother? Would you forgive the man who bought you? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this story.